Okay, Shulie, Vakasha, it's all yours.
Thank you. I will give an unsolicited plug for Rav Eight Shalom. He is not only very, very interesting and smart, he's really funny. So join him. I will not be joining at 2:30 in the morning. Okay, hi everybody. So we are going to a different direction today. Last week we did renegades, we did Karaites, and this year we are looking at those who dreamed and those who came back and tried to rebuild. And the focus is on, of course, as Rabbi Kalman said, those two great Zionists, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, proto-Zionists, we'll call them, right? Because modern Zionism, of course, doesn't exist, but definitely the idea of coming back to the land and living in the land has existed since Abraham. Okay, and the interesting thing about both Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ramban we're going to be talking about next week as well, is that they come from exiles that were relatively good and relatively comfortable. We're going to talk about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the golden age of Spain, but they felt that something was missing. And in that sense, I think this speaks to a lot of us, a lot of Anglo, as we get to call them in Israel now, Anglo Jewry, that maybe living in the goodness and the flesh pots of the diaspora is not always the choice we want to make. They are what we call proto-Zionists, like I said, they see the land of Israel as central to Jewish identity. Where are we going to be traveling this week in search of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ramban? We're going to go a little bit to Spain. We're not doing that much. I focus on the land of Israel. Rabbi Kelman will take you one day to Spain. A little bit to Spain, a little bit to the land of the Khazarim, of Khazaria, which is a very interesting story, but mostly the land of Israel, Jerusalem, and Akko, right? Towards the end, we're going to be talking about Akko because the Ramban, after he comes to Jerusalem, moves on to Akko, and that's where he spends his last days. Okay, so let's just place ourselves in our timeline here. Oh, you do have a trip to Spain. Cool. Okay, see, I'm very in the program. Let's take a look at our timeline. And again, let's just bring ourselves back. We're going to review what happens in the land of Israel at this time, but let's take ourselves into the diaspora for a few minutes. The 8th century, we have this crazy story about this kingdom. We're going to talk about it up near the Caspian Sea, the Khazar Kingdom, that converts to Judaism. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does not really have any contact with the Khazar Kingdom, but he uses this story as kind of a framing device for his most famous book, the Kuzari. And we're going to talk about that. So I wanted us to get a sense of the real story. We're going to take a look at the golden age of Spain, the time that for the Jews, at least, was one of the most prosperous, one of the most comfortable, I would say the best diaspora up until North America in modern times. So we're going to take a look at some of the major figures of that diaspora: Chasdai ibn Shaprut, Shmuel Hanagid, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who is in the Golden Age and yet chooses to leave, Avraham ibn Ezra. We're just going to touch on him for a minute. We're not going to talk about him too much, but he is a friend and perhaps a relative, whether by blood or by marriage, to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. There's all kinds of question marks that we have about the biographies of both of them, but we definitely know that they were very close friends and travel companions and shared many things in common. We're going to talk about Spain and how it's divided between the Muslims and the Christians, but one of the important points during Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's life, right? We see he was born in 1075. So when he's a young man, we have these much more fanatical Muslim group called the Almohads, Berbers from North Africa, who come and they rule in Muslim Spain, making life much less comfortable for Jews than it had been before. And this kind of pushes Rabbi Yehuda Halevi to travel to other places in Spain. Towards the end of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's life, 1140, he sets out for the land of Israel. Does he make it? We will get to that. Okay, so that's our first character. And then we're going to talk about the Ramban, who was born about 50 years after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi dies. Ramban, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, all the same person. He comes to the land of Israel towards the end of his life. And let's just review for a second our chronology of what's happening in the land of Israel, right? During the time of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the time of the Ramban, the Crusaders are ruling in the land of Israel, right? 1099. Remember, they come and they conquer Jerusalem, and you have this 88 years of the Crusaders ruling the entire land. Okay, by the time the Ramban is born, the Crusaders are only in a portion of the land, and by the time the Ramban dies, the Crusaders are almost completely out the door, and the Mamluks are controlling Jerusalem as well as many other places. Okay, so that's just to give us a little bit of a timeline there in terms of the land of Israel. We're also, like I said, we're going to be looking at Akko. So just to briefly review, the Crusaders conquer Akko in 1104. It's lost to the Muslims in 1187, but 4 years later, Richard the Lionheart comes back, comes to the land of Israel, the Third Crusade, returns Akko to the Crusaders, and it becomes the capital of what's called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, even though it doesn't include Jerusalem. Okay, and very interestingly and rather ironically, Akko, under this Second Crusade kingdom, Crusaders are hardly great friends and lovers of the Jews. And yet, Akko in the 12th, 13th century becomes a place that becomes easy for Jews to visit. And we have quite a lot of prominent Jews that either come through Akko, like Maimonides, settle in Akko, like Nachmanides. And it's a place that hosts a very strong Jewish community until, of course, it's destroyed by the Mamluks. And since we're in Akko already, we'll take a quick look at the renewal of the Akko community in the 18th century. Okay, so that's just to get us our timeline here a little bit. Okay, so let's understand, first of all, our story of Spain. Sorry, go back one. Okay, so Spain is unusual. Spain is unusual in the Jewish world. What do I mean by that? Okay, and you can see it very nicely with these maps, even though they're not in English, but I think you could probably figure it out. Okay, the green in both maps is Muslim. Okay, the orange, yellow, brownish, whatever colors you want to call it, is Christian. Okay, and if you look, you can find much more detailed maps on the internet. What basically happens with Spain is a pagan country, right? The Visigoths, then it becomes a Christian country. And with the Muslim conquest, right? Something that we talked about last week, this tornado of Islam sweeping across the known world, most of Spain becomes Muslim. And the first map that you're looking at here is from 750 of the Common Era. Okay, only a little tiny bit remains Christian. And then for the next, give or take 7 centuries, okay, pretty much till 1492, we have something called the Reconquista, right? Christian Spain pushes slowly pushes the Muslims out until finally the Muslims are pushed out altogether. And it's no coincidence, by the way, 1492, for many of us, that is a date that we are familiar with, not only because Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but also because that is the year of the Spanish expulsion, right? That's Gerush Sfarad, the Jews are kicked out. These are not coincidental. Once the Christians kick out the Muslims, they say, well, we don't need these Jews here either. We want to have a completely pure country. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The fact that Spain for many centuries is split between Christians and Muslims is actually something that's very good for the Jews, because in most other places in the world, a country is a Christian country, right? Think about France, Germany, Italy, or a country is a Muslim country, right? North Africa or Babylonia, right? And the Jews are the only minority. But when you have a country that is split into two, the Jews become very useful. Okay, they are essentially neutral, right? They're just looking out for their best interests, and therefore they're going to help the rulers because the rulers are going to help them. They are go-betweens. Jews have relatives in both places, so they can be go-betweens. Jews tend to know languages. Jews are also a go-between, not only on a political, economic, or military level, they are also very useful in terms of learning, right? So Jews who might know Arabic, but who might also know Latin, are translating important works. So Spain is a very unusual place. with a very, very rich culture, okay, both the Arabic culture as well as the Christian culture. And Jews are able to thrive there because of this diversity. Jews tend to thrive in diversity much more than they do in a place that's completely homogeneous. And that's what gives rise to what we call the Golden Age of Spain, where Jews are able to reach the highest positions, not only in the culture, but in politics and economics, and even as we're going to see in the military. And it's very, very unusual. And by the way, this is something we'll talk about in a few classes. This is why the expulsion is such a crash, right? It's such a disaster, such an incredibly terrible thing to happen, because we had been at the peak, right? We had been at the pinnacle, and suddenly we're down at the bottom. So just again, these maps, the one on the left here, 750, the one on the right, which is around the time of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's birth, 1037, not his birth, excuse me, towards the end of his life, 1037. Again, just to kind of place us in terms of our major characters, right? Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is born, not so clear, right? Like I said, we have a lot of question marks about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. So he might be born in Toledo, but he might be born in Tudela. We're not so sure. Today, with the documents coming out from the Cairo Geniza, we're thinking more and more that it's Tudela, which when he was born was still in Muslim Spain. By the time you get towards the end of his life, it's already in Christian Spain. The Ramban is born in Girona, which is it on my map? Is it on my map? It is on my map. Okay, Christian Spain over here on the coast. Just something else that's important to keep in mind, right? Not only do we have these two cultures, right? We have the Arabic culture, the Muslim culture, which is a very rich culture, literary and language and grammar and so many different things. We have the Christian culture. We also have the difference between Spain, Provence, and further north, right? Taking us into Ashkenaz, right? Taking us into the land of Rashi and the Tosfot, okay? And the Ramban is nurtured by both of these different traditions, by the way. So that's important. We're going to come back to that. Okay, so that's really the uniqueness of Spain. Two figures who are often cited as very important in the story of the Golden Age. Chasdai bin Shaprut and Shmuel HaNagid, they're not contemporary, but they're pretty close, right? Chasdai is 10th century, 915 to 970. Shmuel HaNagid is more 11th century, 993 to 1056. They are both very, very prominent Jews in Muslim Spain. Each of them thinks of themselves as the leader of the Jews, okay? This picture here on the left is a picture of a statue of Chasdai bin Shaprut in Spain, in Jaén, in southern Spain. And he is the court physician to the caliphs in Cordoba, and he is the community leader, and he's very involved in Jewish affairs, but he's also involved in Muslim affairs and political affairs. He actually writes a letter to this king of the Khazars, presenting himself essentially as the king of the Jews, right? Now, another thing that's happening during this time period, we talked a lot last time about Babylonia, right? Babylonia is the center of Jewish learning. That's beginning to shift, right? We're coming to the end of the period of the Gaonim. We're coming into the period where Europe is going to be the center, and Spain is becoming one of these important centers of Jewish learning, and Chasdai bin Shaprut is part of that story. Shmuel HaNagid, this is an arch in Elvira, Spain, which is right near where Shmuel HaNagid's grave is, right? And he's also a fascinating figure. Okay, he's a community leader. He's a poet. He's a vizier, right? He's one of the kind of vice presidents or the vice leaders of Muslim Spain. But that's not what's really unusual about him. What's really unusual about him is that he leads the Muslim army. Okay, try to imagine such a thing today. He is a Jew, and he's not just a Jew. He is a religious Jew, and we have religious poetry that he composes before going to battle, after his victories, where he writes, God, look at me and how I went into battle and you helped me and you saved me and I'm going to praise you. And I kept Shabbat and I kept the holidays despite the fact that I had to go into battle, right? This is an unprecedented circumstance for Jews to find themselves in, that they are not in their own sovereign land, under the control of the Muslims, and yet being in such pivotal positions, in such important positions in Muslim society. So let's go to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, born in Muslim Spain, he has a very rich Jewish education. He has a very rich Arabic education. For some of us, it sounds very strange, right? Jews having an Arabic education. It's not very strange. It's very important because for Arabs, okay, for Muslims, I don't want to say for Arabs, for Muslims, the Quran is extremely important. And therefore, the language of the Quran and the grammar, right, and the style is very important. So linguistics and grammar and poetry and everything about language is very, very significant in the Muslim world. Number one, science, right? Science, which today we look at the Muslim world and we say, are you, in our century or not? But science, the Muslim world was in the forefront of scientific discovery, of astronomy, of medicine. The Christian world was way in the dark ages. The Muslim world was very far ahead, and Jews are part of this. They're influenced by it. They're also influencing, right? They're also involved in this learning, in translating Greek texts, in being involved in all these elements of learning. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is really perfectly placed as somebody who is gaining from both these cultures, contributing to both these cultures. Right? One of the things that's fascinating about Jews in the Golden Age of Spain, many of them, including Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, including Abraham ibn Ezra, including Moshe ibn Ezra, Shlomo ibn Gvirol, they are incredible poets, right? Now, when we think about poetry, Jewish poetry, we think, okay, religious poetry, piyutim, keynote, yes, but not only. They're writing love poetry. They're writing wine songs and drinking songs. They are participating in all of the cultural values that are going on around them. And they're doing it really just as well as the Arabs. And they're doing it in Arabic and often in Hebrew as well. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is coming from this really very rich culture. He, like we said, born probably in Tudela, travels to Granada, to Cordoba. The pictures you have here, by the way, this is a picture of the synagogue in Cordoba. It's post Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, but it was a really nice picture, so I brought it anyway. And it just gives us a little bit of an idea. When he goes to Cordoba, he meets with Moshe ibn Ezra, and then he meets with Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, and they become very, very close. They have many, many things in common. Although Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra has a much less charmed life than Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. There are all sorts of possibilities that maybe they were related, that maybe Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's, one of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's children married one of Abraham ibn Ezra's children. Maybe Irene, I know, did a lot of studying of the Ibn Ezra. Maybe she can enlighten us on this fact. But in any case, he travels around, and with the rise of these more radical Muslims, these Almohads, okay, he starts to travel throughout Spain or North Africa, and eventually he ends up in Toledo in Christian Spain and becomes a physician. Okay. The other picture you have here is the statue. Did Rabbi Yehuda Halevi look like this? Probably not. Okay. Oh, we have no idea what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi looked like, but this is an interesting statue. It's an interesting, I don't know if anybody here recognizes it. In Caesarea, there is a fabulous museum. Next time you're in Israel, or for those who live in Israel, go up to Caesarea. There's a great complex of museums called the Raleigh Museum, okay, which were given by philanthropists who have a Sephardic Jewish connection. And there's this whole beautiful courtyard, which is meant to look like, I believe it's meant to look like the Alhambra in Spain. And they have statues of all these major Jewish figures from the Golden Age of Spain, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam and the Ramban, right? So that's what we have over here. Okay, so we said Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is a poet, and he writes a lot of religious poetry. This is probably the most famous poem that he ever wrote. And despite the fact, and this is the poem that I think expresses so strongly this idea that I mentioned in the beginning, despite the fact that he lives in a prosperous and relatively safe for Jews diaspora, He longs for the land of Israel. He longs for Zion. Okay. He writes 35 songs of Zion, Shirei Zion. Some of them we use for the keynote, right? Others are just very famous, like this one. It's not used for the keynote. Let's just read it. It's such a powerful thing. It's very short. I brought you the English, but we'll read it in the Hebrew. Libi b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav, right? The first sentence is the one that's most familiar to us. My heart is in the east and I am in the ends of the west. Ech et amat asher ochal ve'ech ya'arav. How can food taste good to me? Echa shalem nidarai v'asarai. How can I pay all my vows, right? How can I go back and give my sacrifices and connect to God? Ve'od Sion bechevel Edom, va'ani bekevel Arav, right? Very interesting. Sion, Zion, as in the land of Israel, is underneath the fetters, the chains of Edom. Edom is Christianity in rabbinic literature, and the Crusaders are in charge of the land of Israel. And he himself is under the chains of the Arabs, right? And yet he acknowledges that his existence in Spain is not so terrible. Azov kol tuv Sfarad. A light thing would seem to be to leave all the good of Spain. There's a lot of good in Spain. It would be more precious in my eyes to see the dust of the desolate sanctuary. He understands. Land of Israel is not a very comfortable place. Spain is a very comfortable place, but he longs to go back and to return to Zion. And the other poem that's very, very famous, I only brought you one piece of it, is Sion Halo Tish'ali, and a lot of it is borrowed for various other uses, right? We today, it wasn't meant to be written as a kina, as something that we read on Tisha B'Av, but very soon it began to be used like that. Of course, it's full of all sorts of biblical references. And the most famous thing about this poem is its rhythm. Sion Halo Tish'ali L'Shlom Asiraich, Dorshei Shlomech V'hem Yeter Adaraich. Aich. Everything ends like that, and it's a refrain that goes over and over again, and it has kind of a hypnotic power to it. And we'll just look at a little bit of it. It's much longer, right? I only brought you a little bit, but it's addressing Zion, right? Will you not ask after the welfare of your prisoners? Now, something very interesting, like I said, we've borrowed for various things a lot of the pieces of this poem, and you'll see the most famous one, the most famous borrowing is at the end. But Asirei Zion, right? The prisoners of Zion. This is a phrase that started to be used in the fight for Soviet Jewry, right? Or for really anybody who was forbidden to come on Aliyah to the land of Israel. So most famously Soviet Jewry, but also Ethiopian Jews, right? Other Jews who were not able to come, they got the name prisoners of Zion, Asirei Zion, Dorshei Shlomech Behem Yeter Adarayach, who seek your welfare and are the remains of your flock. Miyam u'mizrach, mitzafon v'teiman, shalom rachok v'karov, right? The welfare of those far and near, all around. And as the poem goes on, he lists many places in Tanakh, right? Places in the journey of Jacob in the land of Israel, Beit El and Machanaim and Pniel. He mentions Hebron. Okay, a lot of different biblical resonances, but the most famous, of course, here is not a biblical reference, but using the song for a modern reference. Livkot anotecha nitanim, when I'm crying for your suffering, I am a jackal. The eight achlom shivat shvutecha, when I dream of the return of your captives, ani kinor l'shirayach, which of course is part of Naomi Shemer's song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, which is so full of so many references to so many different things. If you ever want to hear something interesting, there's a podcast by, I can't remember who, but if you look, you could definitely find somebody doing a whole explanation of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and all the references in it. Okay, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, yearning for Zion, thinking about Zion, how can I come back? Where will I come back? And this is where we get to our story, our rather strange story of the Khazars. Okay, so if you, like me, are a little lost in your Asian geography, okay, this is where Khazaria is, right? Not far from the Caspian Sea. Kiev, right? Part of the former Soviet Union. today, not anymore, right? There is no more Soviet Union. And this is a very strange story that we have in both Jewish and non-Jewish sources, that sometime around 740 CE, the king of Khazaria decides to convert to Judaism and to take his country with him, right? And the origin story, which is told, like I said, in various places, in various variations, right? Both Jewish and non-Jewish, but many of them share this theme that basically he calls in people who are from different religions, and he has them present the positive things about their religions and why is your religion the most true, and then he chooses the Jews, right? Why does he choose the Jews? That's a very interesting question, right? And another very interesting question is, are they really converts? Like, is it like a full conversion? Do they take on all of the commandments? Or is it sort of conversion in name only? We don't really know, okay? But we do know that this story seems to have really happened. And one of the most interesting, like I said, we have things like Hasdai ibn Shaprut writing a letter to the king of the Khazars and other references to it. Yehuda Halevi, of course, knows the story. With the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, we have more and more fascinating documents that shed light on this kind of a murky period in Jewish history. One of them is from the 10th century, and it's a letter, right? A letter that a Meshulach, right? A guy who's collecting tzedakah shows up in Cairo, and he says, I'm collecting money, and I'm a representative of the Jews in the Khazar Kingdom. This is in the 10th century. This is a good 200 years later. So there is something to this story, right? Eventually, they ultimately assimilate back and become Muslims again, and their Judaism does not continue, but the story seems to be correct. Now, why do they do this? So one suggestion is that as Islam and Christianity are kind of advancing into this pagan world over here, one way to set yourself apart is to say, well, okay, I'm going to be a monotheist, but I'm not going to be your kind of monotheist. I'm going to be a Jew. I'm going to be something different. Is that the reason? Like I said, we don't really know. But Jews knew about this story and they were understandably fascinated by it, right? Here is this place, this kingdom where Jews rule and Jews have sovereignty. Remember, we're in the diaspora. The land of Israel is in the hands of the Muslims and then of the Crusaders. And here's a place where Jews are the rulers. So Jews are very excited by this whole story. And it's a story that's really perpetuated and perhaps grows to greater than its real proportions. By the way, fascinating twist that has happened in more recent years is that anti-Semites have taken this story, right, and have started to say, well, all Jews are really descended from these converts of the Khazar Kingdom. And Jews are not really indigenous to the land of Israel, and they didn't really have a history here. They're actually just pagans from the Asian steppes, and they eventually converted it. We know this is, of course, not true, right? But it's a convenient lie for anti-Semites and for anti-Zionists to say, well, Jews really have no original connection to the land of Israel. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is hundreds of years later. But and it's very doubtful that he met anybody that was really connected with the Khazar Kingdom. But this is a useful story for him. And he borrows this story to use it as a framing device for a fascinating book that he writes. Now, we today call this book the Kuzari. That's not the original name. This is a book that's written in Arabic, by the way. And the title of it is In Defense of the Despised Religion. And he takes this framing story of the king, right? The Khazaria, right? The Khazari, bringing in the various religions as well as a Greek philosopher, right? And the very first piece of the book is about each one presenting their ideas, but the bulk of the book, of course, is the rabbi, or as he's called in Hebrew, in the Hebrew translation, the Chaver, right? The fellow, the learned one, who comes along and explains Judaism and why Judaism Judaism is really the correct religion. Now, the Khazari is a fascinating book. There are many, many, many elements in it. We're really going to focus on the one of the land of Israel, but I'll just point out one other one. And I am not a philosopher, so don't hold me to all the details. But one of the things that the Khazari is very famous for pointing out is that the Chaver points out that the others, the philosopher, the Christian, the Muslim, they have very theoretical underpinnings for their religion, whereas Judaism has an empirical underpinning for its religion. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have revelation, right? We have the giving of the Torah. This is something that many, many people have taken this idea from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and speak about it centuries afterwards. Revelation is to thousands of people, and thousands of people do not pass on a story that's not true, as opposed to Christianity, right? Jesus has just a few disciples. Islam, Muhammad has his revelations, but they're very individual. Here you have revelation to an entire people who pass it on for generations and generations. So it's an empirical proof of the truth of Judaism. You can agree or disagree, but it is a strong argument. Okay. But one of the what's important to us is he focuses a lot on the chosenness of the Jewish people, right? Things that are not so popular to say today, but how there are special qualities to the Jewish people and the Hebrew language, and particularly the land of Israel. And this is the little piece that I brought you here, where the Chaver talks to the Khazari, and he tells him about the specialness of the land of Israel. Mostly, that is the only place where someone can receive prophecy. And don't worry, the Khazari challenges him and says, "Well, what about this one who received prophecy in the desert?" Okay, we're not going to go into it, okay? But read the book; it's fascinating, right? But we'll just read this little piece. You will have no difficulty in perceiving that one country may have higher qualifications than others. There are places in which particular plants, metals, or animals are found, or where the inhabitants are distinguished by their former character, etc., etc. Yet I never heard, says the Khazari, that the inhabitants of the land of Israel were better than other people. The rabbi answers him, "How about the hill on which you say the vines thrive so well? If it had not been properly planted and cultivated, it would never produce grapes. Priority belongs in the first instance to the people, which as stated before is the essence and kernel of the nations. In the second instance, to the country, on account of the religious acts connected with it, which I would compare to the cultivation of the vineyard. No other place would share the distinction of the divine influence, just as no other mountain might be able to produce good wine. You want prophecy, you want a special religious aura, shall we say, you have to be in the land of Israel." And then, of course, the Khazari pushes Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and of course, it's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi pushing himself. Hey, if this is so, you fall short of the duty laid down in your law by not endeavoring to reach that place and making it your abode in life and death, although you say, "Have mercy on Zion," and believe that the Shekhinah will return hither, right? No, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, what are you still doing here in the diaspora if it's so important to go to the land of Israel? Okay, and that's where we really ask the question, does he actually make it to the land of Israel? He's disillusioned by the diaspora. He understands his places in Israel, but it's not easy, right? It's very much a lech lecha moment. He has his family, he has his career, he has his admirers, he has his community in Spain. And to go to the land of Israel, which is desolate, which is ruled by the Crusaders, it's not very easy, right? The end of the Khazari, the rabbi prepares to leave. The rabbi was concerned to leave the land of the Khazars and to go to Jerusalem. The king did not want to let him go and asked him, "What can be sought in the land of Israel nowadays, since the divine reflex is absent from it? And with a pure mind and desire, can one approach God, and one can approach God in any place?" Which, again, I think is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi talking to himself. Can't I be close to God anywhere? It's going to be hard for me there. The rabbi answered, "The land of Israel is especially distinguished by the Lord of Israel. No function can be perfect except there. Jerusalem can only be rebuilt when Israel yearns for it to such an extent that they embrace her stones and her dust." And of course, at the end of the book, the rabbi sets off for Jerusalem. What about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi? So we know, and again, we are learning more and more from documents in the Geniza, that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does set off for the land of Israel. Okay, in 1140, he arrives in Alexandria in Egypt. He moves on to Cairo, and everybody is very excited because he is something of a celebrity. And the Jewish community there host him and fet him, and he can't leave that fast because it's really nice there. And we really did not know up until, like we said, the discovery of the Geniza, did he actually ever leave and make his way to the land of Israel? There's a very, very famous legend that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does come to the land of Israel. And as he's making his way towards the Western Wall or towards the Temple Mount, or however you want to tell the story, he is struck down by an Arab on a horse, and he dies there on his way. There's a lot of reasons why this story doesn't make much sense, chiefly because there were no Arab horsemen in Jerusalem in 1141. Okay, this is the height of Crusader Jerusalem. But the legend became so strong that I'm just going to make you dizzy for a minute. This first picture that we have here is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. The steps going from the Western Wall up to the Jewish quarter are named after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi because of this story. But what we now know from the Geniza is that he does set sail. He arrives in the land of Israel in the spring of 1141. He dies in the summer. Does he make it to Jerusalem? We don't know. Okay, we don't know. And perhaps one day we will, but meanwhile, we do not. Let's shift to Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban. Okay, Nachmanides. If I had to pick my 10 favorite rabbinic personalities, don't you all do that, right? The Ramban would definitely be high up there. And I am not alone. Much greater than I said that, right? Rav Lichtenstein of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Zichron Tzadik Livracha, was asked once, I don't know if he was asked in this way, but if you could take one book with you to a desert island, what would you take? And he said the Perush Ramban la Torah, right? Ramban's commentary on the Torah, because it's so deep and it's so intricate and it's so fascinating. So the Ramban is born in Girona, which we saw is north, but northeast on the coast. This is actually a picture of part of the Jewish quarter in Girona. He is a cousin to Rabbeinu Yonah of Girona. We're going to talk about the Ramban and the fact that he lives in this really very interesting place that's Spain, but it's close to Provence. He has teachers who are from Ashkenaz, right? But also teachers from Spain. He's a bridge between worlds. We're going to come back to that next time when we talk about the Maimonidean controversy, because he really tries to be a peacemaker. He's brilliant, right? He is probably most well known for his commentary to the Torah, which is deep and rich in many ways. Real Talmud scholars know him as a Talmudist and a halachist, and he's one of the most important Rishonim on the Gemara. He's also a Kabbalist, right? And a lot of mystical stuff that's kind of hidden there in his commentary. Besides all that, he makes a living. He's a doctor and he leads the community. Okay, so he's a fascinating synthesis of the learning of Ashkenaz and the learning of Sfarad, and he has a huge influence on the Jewish world. The picture you see here on the left is something that was discovered in the 1970s, not so far from Akko, a place called Tel Kisan, which was near a major road that led along the coast. And I hope you all can see it. It's a seal, right? Anybody who was important in the old days had a seal. And the seal says very clearly, I mean, even if you're not so good at reading old things, Moshe Rabbi Nachman, Nun, what's Nun? Nach Nafsho, right? Rabbi Nachman, who has passed away, or blessed memory. Girondi, meaning he comes from Girona. This is something that he kept with him all the time. Chazak, okay? So this is it's a great seal that we found. Was it when when the Ramban was traveling from Jerusalem to Akko? Who knows, right? But it was found on the road, and it's a great hello from the Ramban. Now, the Ramban is even more than Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I don't know if more emotionally, but certainly more in the way he writes. He is the ultimate proto-Zionist. He believes that the land of Israel is God's dwelling place, and it is the only true place in which to serve God. Okay. We have fascinating things that he writes in his commentary to the Torah, where he essentially says, keeping the commandments outside the land of Israel, you need to do it. It's kind of nice, but it's not the real thing, which is a really far-reaching thing to say. So we're going to read probably the most famous quotes that he has on this. Just the gentleman here on the left is James I of Aragon, who's the the Christian king of Spain in the time of the Ramban. We're going to come back to him in a moment because he's very important in the next stage in Ramban's life. Okay, but take a look at this piece of the commentary. It's a very long commentary on this verse to Leviticus, to Vayikra, 1825. Where the context of the commentary is that it's talking about all of the terrible forbidden relations, the arayot, sexual relations you're not allowed to have. And if you do those things, the land will vomit you out. And the Ramban says, well, why is it worse to do this in the land of Israel than anywhere else? These are immoral things to do because the land of Israel is different, right? And listen to what he says. The land of Israel is like no other land. It is unable to contain sinners. It is on the basis of this matter that the rabbis have said in the Sifrei, you perish quickly from off the good land, and you shall lay up my words in your heart and in your soul. Although I banish you from the land, and here's where we get to what I was saying, make yourself distinctive by the commandments so that when you return, they shall not be novelties to you. Okay, so God is going to banish us from the land because the land cannot contain sinners. But the land is really the only true place where you can keep the law. And when you leave the land of Israel and you go out into exile, all right, the Ramban here quotes a verse from the book of Jeremiah. Make yourself distinctive. Hatzivi lach tziyunim, which essentially means set up signposts. Okay, put signposts for yourself. Right, he's going to quote that in a second. So that when you return, they shall not be novelties to you. I.e., keeping the law outside the land of Israel is practice for the real thing. This is a very, very far-reaching idea, which I don't know if anybody else suggests something similar. This can be compared to a master who was angry with his wife and sent her back to her father's house and told her, adorn yourself with precious things so that when you come back, they will not be novelties to you. Okay, you need to be ready to come back and be able to serve me again, says God, but meanwhile you're practicing. And so did the prophet Jeremiah say, set yourself signposts. These are the commandments by which Israel is made distinctive. For the main fulfillment of the commandments is to be kept when dwelling in the land of God. Now, he doesn't say there's no value to keeping the commandments outside of the land of Israel, but the main keeping of them, the completion of keeping the mitzvot is only in the land of Israel, which gives incredible importance to the land of Israel. Okay, another place where the Ramban expresses the same idea, okay, the Rambam, Maimonides, writes before in the introduction to his massive halachic work, right, the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaChazakah, he writes the Sefer HaMitzvot, right, he writes the list of 613 commandments, and the Ramban goes over this list, and then he writes a list of mitzvot sheshachach harambam, right, it's great, right, he says these are the commandments that the Rambam, the Maimonides forgot to list. Trust me, the Maimonides didn't forget very much. Okay, but Nachmanides doesn't want to insult him, and he says these are things that he really should have included, but he didn't. Okay, and the fourth one is this, right? Shenistavenu lareshet haaretz asher natan hakel yitzalel la'avotenu la'Avram Yitzchak liYaakov. We are commanded to inherit the land that God has given to our forefathers and not to leave it in the hands of other nations or to leave it desperate. God says, I've given you this land to inherit it, to settle in it. Settling the land of Israel is equivalent to all of the other commandments, right? One can very easily ask, well, why doesn't Maimonides include this mitzvah? Why does he not see settling the land as a commandment? And there are a lot of different suggestions. One is, he doesn't see it as a commandment in these days because it's not possible to do. There are other suggestions that the Rambam doesn't include kind of general mitzvot that include many other mitzvot, like Shemitah, like all of the commandments that are connected to the land, and therefore he doesn't list this. But for whatever reason, Maimonides does not include settling the land as one of the mitzvot, and Nachmanides does. Okay, so already while he is in Spain, living a very full life in Spain, he sees the land of Israel as the center of everything. Now, the Ramban's life is going to change very dramatically towards the end of his life when he is forced to take part in a disputation. Okay, Jews in the Christian world, and I don't think this happened in the Muslim world, although I could be wrong, but I have never heard about it. Jews in the Christian world were often forced to take part in debates with Christians. What was the idea? You chose the greatest scholar, the greatest rabbi, the community leader who would come and have to debate a Christian, often, by the way, a Jew who had converted to Christianity, about the truth of Judaism versus the truth of Christianity. And the idea, of course, on the Christian side, on the church's side, was that, of course, Christianity is going to win. The Jew is going to lose. In his great defeat, the rabbi, the community leader, is going to take on Christianity, and the whole community will come along with him. In reality, what often happened was that Jews did not have any form of freedom of speech. And no matter whatever happened, if you lost, you lost. If you won, you lost, right? If you lost the debate, Judaism is defeated. It looks very bad. But if you win, you also lose, because the church will take its revenge. And as we said, Spain is a little bit different, okay? And when the church comes to King James I and says to him, we want you to conduct a disputation between Friar Paul, right, who is Pablo Cristiani, he's a Jew who converted to Christianity. I want you to pick the most prominent Jew and have a debate with him. Obviously, King James is going to go to the Ramban, because the Ramban is the leader of the community. But the Ramban says that I will do it. I don't want to do it, but if you are commanding me to do it, I will do it only on the condition that I have freedom of speech, which was very unusual in Christian Europe. But the king allows him. Now, he, of course, wins the debate, right? There's no question. The Ramban is one of the most brilliant people ever. And of course, he wins the debate against this Jew who converted, who doesn't really know anything. Okay, but there's a couple of things that are just fascinating about this disputation. And of course, the outcome of it is very significant. So if you take a look, we have the Ramban writes a book, which is, of course, his fatal error, but we'll see that in a moment. He writes a book called Sefer HaVikuach, the Book of the Disputation, where he writes his version of what happened. Right? And the introduction is like this, right? The Disputation of Barcelona, 1263. The Hebrew report of Moshe ben Nachman, our Lord the King commanded me to dispute with Friar Paul in his palace before him and his advisors in Barcelona. I replied, I will do as the king commands if you permit me to speak freely. And of course, this is the Ramban's version of events. Did it really happen this way? We don't know. I hereby request the permission of the king and the permission of Friar Raymond of Penaforte and his associates who are here, right? One of the leaders of the church. Friar Raymond of Penaforte replied, so long as you do not utter blasphemies. I said to them, I wish to observe your law in this regard, but I also wish to speak freely in debate as you speak freely. I have the wisdom to speak properly in debate as you indicate, but it must be according to my will. And they gave me permission to speak freely. Okay, so that's already a fascinating thing. Now, the Ramban says all sorts of interesting things. If you want to read a really interesting book, read the Disputation. Some of the things he says, you can look at them and you say, well, does he say it because he has to give this debate, right? And does he really believe these things? The most famous thing like that is when he talks about Midrash, right? Because Friar Pablo brings examples from the Talmud about the Messiah, and the Messiah has come. That's one of the major points. Has the Messiah come already or not? And the Ramban says, well, you know, we Jews, we have the Bible and we have the law and we have the Midrash, what he calls sermones, right, in Latin. And we don't have to believe everything that the Midrash, that the legends say. Did the Ramban really believe that? That's an interesting question. Okay, but that's what he says in the debate. Now, like I said, one of the major issues is, well, has the Messiah come? Which, of course, according to the Christians, Jesus has come, or has he not? So Friar Paul is going to say he has come, and the Ramban is going to say not so much. And this is, I think, my favorite passage here. Right? Friar Paul inquired, do you believe that the Messiah has already come? I answered, no, I believe, and no, rather, he has not come. It is impossible for me to accept that he is the Messiah, for the prophet has said he will have dominion from sea to sea, and the Nazarene, Jesus, had no dominion. During his life, he was persecuted by his enemies and was in hiding from them. Similarly, the prophet states, and this is the best line of all, did he really say this? I hope so, but it would have taken a lot of courage. The prophet states, in the time of the Messiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, right? We all know the famous prophecy of Isaiah. Then the time of the Messiah is going to be peace. From the days of the Nazarene till now, the entire world has been full of violence and robbery. You dare to say the Messiah has come? Look at this world. Is this a messianic world? Right? And then he adds the real kick. Indeed, the Christians spill more blood than the rest of the nations. How difficult it would be for you, my Lord King, and these your knights, if they would neither lead war anymore, right? You just gotta, applaud the Ramban there. But so he handily wins the debate and everything goes okay. Except then he writes a book, and the church is very, very disturbed by this book because, a book is real. A book is out there in the world and it can't be denied. And so they go to King James and they say, listen, you have to banish this fellow from your kingdom. And King James calls him in and he banishes him. He says, you must leave Spain. Where are you going to go? And the Ramban, who was not a young man anymore, right? He's in his 60s. He could have gone to Portugal. He could have gone to Italy. He would have been warmly welcomed by any of these Jewish communities, but he follows his beliefs and he picks himself up and he goes to the land of Israel, right? And he comes to the land of Israel. He comes in 1267, right? He arrives in Akko, and then he makes his way to Jerusalem, and he writes a very famous letter home to his son. Okay? What shall I tell you about the land? The sum of it is that the holier the place, the worse the destruction. Jerusalem is more desolate than the rest of the land, Judah more than the Galilee. Yet for all its destruction, it is wonderful. Here he's writing about Jerusalem. It has nearly 2,000 inhabitants. There are no Israelites among them. Okay, remember, we're in the 1260s. The Mamluks, the Mongol invasion is happening. The Mamluks have come. The Jewish community has been decimated by the Crusaders. They're only slowly coming back. There are only 2 dyers who purchase dye from the government, unto whom a minyan gathers for prayers in their house on Shabbat. I encouraged them, and we found an abandoned building with marble pillars and a lovely arch, which we converted into a synagogue, for the city is wide open, and anyone who wishes to take possession of an abandoned building can do so. People have contributed to the refurbishing of the building, and we have already sent to the city of Shem for Torah scrolls that have been sent there for safekeeping. Whoever is privileged to see the temple in its destruction will be privileged to see it rebuilt and repaired when the divine presence returns to it. Now, many of us are familiar with Beit Knesset HaRamban, with the Ramban synagogue in the center of the Jewish quarter in the Old City. It's a beautiful old building. It does have beautiful old pillars. Was this the building the Ramban is talking about, or was there perhaps an even earlier stage on Mount Zion? We don't know, but we do know that this synagogue is used very early on, if not by the Ramban, then certainly the generation afterwards. It's a beautiful old synagogue. However, it's only used till about the 15th century, okay, at which point the Jewish community has to leave it. Okay. And again, if you're familiar a little with the Jewish quarter, you know that right next to the Ramban synagogue is a minaret, is a mosque, right? And this is a crazy story. There was a Jew, we know this is a true story because we have a few different sources about it. There was a Jew who lived in Jerusalem who just kept getting into fights with his neighbors until finally he was so, could not get along with his community, converts to Islam. And in order to really stick it to his community, he builds a mosque in the center of the Jewish quarter where all the Jews are living. And the Muslims basically say, well, there's a mosque here. There can't be a synagogue next to a mosque. And the Ramban synagogue has to be vacated. You cannot use it anymore. And at that point, Jewish life moves to new synagogues that are built, what are called the 4 Sephardic synagogues. This is the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai synagogue. And it's only in 1967, right, 700 years after the Ramban comes back to Jerusalem, that the Ramban synagogue is reopened, is cleaned out, is used as a synagogue again. But the Ramban is really the one who restarts Jewish life in Jerusalem. He also goes to other places as well. Okay. He goes to Hebron. He writes this again in the same letter that I read to you. May God bless you, my son Nachman. May you say the goodness of Jerusalem, etc., etc. I am writing you this letter from Jerusalem with praise and thanksgiving to the Creator. I managed to arrive in peace on the 9th of Elul, 1267, and remained there until the day after Yom Kippur. Then I went to Hebron for the holiday of Sukkot. I went to the city of the graves of our forefathers to prostrate myself before them and to purchase a grave for myself there. We're going to see at the very end, where is the Ramban buried? We don't really know. Okay? But he does go to other places. And one of the fascinating things, there's actually been a whole book that's been written about this, is that a lot of his commentary was written while he was still in Spain, his biblical commentary, but he comes to the land of Israel and he changes things and he edits things because he actually sees the real places. And probably the most famous example of that is the story about the death of Rachel and Rachel's tomb, which is this nice old picture that you have here, right? Where he writes about where is Rachel's tomb in relation to Bethlehem, right? To Beit El and to Bethlehem. And he writes about, it says Kivrat Aretz, right? Which he says is a very, very great distance. And that's what he says. I wrote that it was a great distance from Bethlehem. And then he says, Ze katafti tchila. At first, I wrote this, at first, meaning when I was in Spain. B'achshav, shezachiti ubati ani liYerushalayim, shevach la'el hatov ha'metiv. And now that, thank God, I've been able to come myself, merit to come to Jerusalem. Ra'iti be'enai, I saw with my own eyes, she'ein mikvurat Rachel Beit Lechem afilu mil, right? He sees that Kever Rachel is actually in Bethlehem, right? The Bethlehem of his time. And therefore he corrects his parish, right? So it's fascinating because something that he wrote about from his understanding and language and whatever he knew from the Bible while he was in the diaspora, but coming to the land of Israel, you're seeing things with new eyes. He doesn't stay long in Jerusalem. He makes his way to Akko, where again, he's part of the renewed Jewish community in Akko, right? Of course, we're talking about the old city of Akko. And he comes here and we're in kind of the tail end, the last few years of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. We're going to skip this. I'm sorry. We might come back to it a different time. But he comes to this Crusader city, and this is a city that, despite the Crusader antipathy to Jews, becomes kind of a place that many Jews come to because the port is open and there's travel from Europe. So this very, very Christian city, right, which has these Gothic hallways and churches and the Templar tunnel and the whole toilet system, right? This very, very Christian city becomes a city that Jews are coming to. Maimonides comes through Akko, even though he doesn't stay, right? But he writes about how he comes through Akko and eventually he goes on to Hebron. When we talk about Maimonides next week, I'll bring this again. Nachmanides, 300 rabbis, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris. There seems to also be a yeshiva in Akko, but it all comes crashing to a halt when the Crusaders are vanquished and Akko is destroyed. This is from something that was found relatively recently, a shipwreck in Haifa Bay, where we found all these Crusader coins. Okay? And we think that this is from people fleeing the destruction of Akko, Christians fleeing the destruction of Akko. The Mamluks destroy Akko, and it's only rebuilt by the Ottoman Turks many, many years later. We're actually going to skip the Ottoman story. Sorry, took a little bit longer, but I wanted to get to the story of where is the Ramban buried. So despite the fact that the Ramban, even though it's only a few years, he has a great impact on two communities, right? He revitalizes the Jerusalem community. He's a strong part of the Akko community. And despite the fact that he's such an important and famous personality, we don't know where he's buried, which is really unusual. We don't even have like a clear tradition of where he's buried. So of course we saw, he writes about Hebron. He says, I went to Hebron and I purchased a grave for myself there. So here, of course, we have a picture of the Cave of Machpelah, right? The Cave of the Patriarchs. So it would seem, according to what the Ramban says, that his grave should be in Hebron. However, we don't have a place. We don't have a tradition. There's a very ancient Jewish cemetery in Hebron. We don't have anything that relates to the Ramban. Others say, well, he died in Akko. Jews weren't buried in Akko, but they were buried nearby in Haifa. We know about Jewish grave sites in Haifa. This is actually of an Amora, right? Somebody who's much earlier than the Ramban, but perhaps he's buried there. This is near Rambam Hospital in the north of Haifa, in Haifa Bay. Is he buried in Haifa? Maybe. Other people say, well, maybe he's buried in Tiberias, right? And that's the picture you have here on the bottom. This is a picture of the entrance to Maimonides' tomb in Tiberias. Like I said, we're going to talk about Maimonides next time. Maybe he's buried here because this is the home of the great rabbis of the tradition. Maybe he's buried here. Another tradition is maybe he's buried in Jerusalem, in the Kidron Valley, with a lot of other important graves that are down there. Bottom line, we don't know. We have never found a Tzion Kever. We have never found anything that says this is the Ramban's grave. And we don't even have a clear tradition, which we do have about many other people. It might not be a correct tradition. It might not be a true tradition, but it's a clear tradition. We don't have that about the Ramban, which is somewhat sad considering how connected the Ramban was to the land of Israel and how he definitely is buried in the land of Israel, but we don't know where. So we're not leaving the Ramban behind. Don't worry, there's too much to talk about with him. Next time we are going to talk about the Maimonidean controversy. And we're going to come back to the Ramban, who has a very strong role in that. But right now, let's take a quick look at questions and comments. Go back to the beginning here. Okay, sources, flesh pots. Okay, trip to Spain. Okay, Spain was divided between the Moors, the Arabs, and the Muslims, right? We're talking about this. Okay, Irene, who has done a lot of research on Rabbi Abba and Ibn Ezra in this time period, says according to the Geniza, I'm assuming is what you're basing this on, that he's born in Tudela. Okay, I don't know anything about the transcript, so don't ask me. Were there non-religious Jews back then? I don't know what this was in relation to, but essentially no, right? Somebody else just said this to me. It was interesting, right? Everybody, there's no such thing as Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. Everybody is Jewish. Some Jews are not such good Jews as other Jews, right? But everybody is essentially, there aren't a lot of choices, right? So you are following the general Jewish laws and Jewish culture. You're within the community. Okay, but you are also, depending on where you live, could be very involved in secular culture as well. Hey, in Cordova, I sat in the cafe in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi Square. That sounds nice. That's what we should all do. Okay. Right, radical Muslims, unlikely about intermarriage, but they were great friends. Okay, so again, Irene, Abraham and Ibn Ezra also introduced humor into Jewish poetry. So we have to have a class on the Ibn Ezra given by Irene because she really knows much more about it than I do. Okay, what form of Spanish was spoken at the time? First of all, they're speaking Arabic. Okay, I don't know anything about Spanish, but Arabic, Latin, these are the languages that really we're talking about. Assyrian, Sion, okay, I don't know anything about that, right? Latin, Spanish, Arabic, etc. Okay, Jews descended from the Khazars. What is more important, sufficient yearning for the land or behaving in a manner that will not spur the land from spewing you out? I would think both of them are pretty important. Okay, Yehuda Levi was actually killed in a shipwreck en route to Israel from Alexandria. Yes, the story that he arrived in the land of Israel was a myth. It's the double nun on the seal means that he died. No, that not the Ramban. The Ramban did not die. Rabbi Nachman, right? The Ramban's father was not alive anymore. Okay. The Jewish Museum in Gerona puts you in the time period with a full history of the Ramban, a quick train ride from Barcelona, off the beaten track. Okay, I'm going. Take me, guys. I'll be there. Okay, there is a very interesting film about the disputation. I don't know where you can get hold of it today, but I have seen it. It's fascinating. And there's also, yes, a book, Chaim Maccabee. Oh, thank you. YouTube link. Excellent. Okay, you guys can watch the disputation. The Ramchal, also, we don't know exactly where he was buried. Yes. And anything else? I think that's it. We went through all the questions. Beautiful. So thank you, everybody. Rabbi Kalman is not here, so I am going to end the class, and I do not know to tell you the coming attractions, so I apologize. I can tell you my coming attractions. We are going to be doing the Maimonidean controversy, so we're going to be talking about Maimonides as well as continuing with some Nachmanides. So come back. Same time, same channel, only you'll be in daylight savings time by then. Thanks, everybody.
Time.
So Shulie,
Yes.
it's still going to, so right now we started at 1 o'clock in America. So next week when we will be on regular time, we're going to go back to noon.
Correct. We will be back on our 7-hour change. I'm always teaching at 7 p.m. So for you guys, whatever time that is. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. And again, I'm sure Rabbi Kelman will send out reminders. Okay. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Thank you very much.